when the judge, who is the mediator of justice, enters the room, you stand up in the same way that when the priest enters the sanctuary, you stand up. And you don't sit down until they've assumed their position. There's a liturgy to the law. We don't think of it in those terms, but if you appreciate the history of where our procedures descend from, you realize, oh, I'm at church right now.
Yeah, it's a public confession.
It is a public confession.
And we were talking about...
And it's a public worship, right? When the judge comes in, they're wearing a vestment. It separates them from us, and they're mediating this power of justice that is beyond us.
Right there, it would have been a nice time for it to drop right here.
We can do this here, watch me rock the flow. Killing it a must, never option, no.
Spent guys at the crab table, still ain't signed to a rap label. DVD when I ain't have cable. I got balls, he ain't rap able. A 6D for me is man fatal. Can't see me like a bad angle.
Absolutely, ain't going nowhere. We will be forever, ever and ever.
Peace, beautiful family. This is Dr. Walter Hidalgo, and this is the Know Thyself Show. No podcast, even though we're still podding. The Know Thyself Show utilizes the metaphor of the shelf in order to extrapolate the self. And the way we do that is we invite guests to come in and share something about themselves. And before I introduce my guests, I want to go through the agenda. First and foremost, check out the website, knowthyself.tv. If you're looking for workshops for tweens, young adults, if you're looking for coaching, if you want to purchase a copy of my book, Beyond the Four Walls, The Rising Ministry and Spirituality of Hip Hop, you can find that all through the website, so definitely check it out, knowthyself.tv. You can find it right here. The next thing we do is I like to always shout out a group of individuals. And today, I want to give a big shout out to all my journalists. All my attorneys. Because I'm fresh out of court right now. This is very real, but you gotta have, it's true what they say, the pen is mightier than the sword. And you gotta have a good lawyer. You really do in this world. I want to give a shout out to all my authors. Anybody that has ever written or published anything in their life, man. Because as Dr. Cohn always said, you must find your voice. And I want to give a shout out to all the people that search for knowledge and wisdom like they search for silver and gold. Proverbs 2. Because I got here somebody that I love, that I admire, that I respect, and that I'm so proud of. My brother from another, Roberto Alejandro.
Thank you so much for having me. No, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on, and we've been talking about it for a little while.
Yeah.
And we've had trouble connecting, but it's an honor to be here.
Oh,
I appreciate it so much.
And
this work you do is inspiring.
Oh, thank you, brother. I only get inspired by the people that inspire me. So. We here. So as we always do, I like to contextualize stuff. I've known R for a while. You know what I'm saying? We went to graduate school together, but, I want to go back in time, as I say to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, hop on that elevator, because you're originally from?
Puerto Rico.
From Puerto Rico, born?
Born, yeah.
And then you grew up
in Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I was thinking to myself, making an ignorant statement, right? Because you grew up in Amherst, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, what the hell are Puerto Ricans doing in Amherst? But if you do the knowledge, there are Puerto Ricans in every state in the United States. That is a fact.
Yeah.
We are everywhere. You are everywhere.
We weren't a huge population in Amherst, but we were there. We were there. And we had bigger populations nearby. So there's a large Puerto Rican community in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Facts, yes.
In Holyoke, Massachusetts.
Lawrence.
But they're in Western Mass, a half hour away or 45 minutes away, you've got two cities that had large Puerto Rican populations. And, we're not far from New York City, so some of that. And, Hartford, Connecticut is also not that far from Amherst. It's like maybe an hour and change down the highway. And, I went to law school in Hartford, Connecticut.
Slow down. We're going to get there. We're going to get there because this is very important. No, this is true.
But that community there owns Hartford.
Facts. That is a fact. That is 100% fact. Or we were to step inside into your household. What would we see? What would we hear? Talk to us about your upbringing a little bit.
Oh, growing up.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I guess you would have found my brother and I watching TV. So my mother today is a professor of education. When we first got to the States, both of my parents were students. And then once they wrapped up their studies, around 1989, we moved to Massachusetts. My father was teaching at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst.
Okay.
And my mother found a job working as a social worker. I'm pretty sure in the Holyoke, Massachusetts area. And then after that, she was the director of the Every Woman Center. And this is while she was doing her doctorate in education. And the Every Woman Center is like an educational center at the University of Massachusetts. And then once she finished her doctorate, she transitioned into teaching.
And it was some of the political engagement that your dad was involved in.
Yeah, I mean,
here, right?
We ended up in the States because my father led student protests in the late 70s and early 80s at the University of Puerto Rico, and he was a law student. So the path I'm on now was really the path he was on.
That's an easy layup for you right there. Yeah. It's interesting because the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, my brother. Because what drew my mother to come here was because her father was politically engaged, and unfortunately it ended up to his demise early.
Oh, wow.
And there's a book called Nunca Más that was written in Guatemala that accounted the 250,000 plus indigenous people that were murdered, that were speaking up, hidden, kidnapped,
disappeared.
Disappeared. So it's interesting, and now it's easy for me to say, like, I'm assuming this is what led you down this path that you're in, brother, because then you went to law school, right?
It's funny the way, I would say the spirit works. Everybody has their own beliefs about this sort of thing. You might call it fate. You might,
the Kairos moment.
Yeah, the Kairos. My father wasn't able to finish his law degree. His political activities got him kicked out of the University of Puerto Rico, and because the students were shutting down the university and all this, and he couldn't get another school to accept him because he was a troublemaker on the island at this point. So we had to leave. He had to go to the U.S. and he was able to pursue a doctorate instead at Princeton University. So not a tragedy in that sense. It pushed him into another path, but he landed on his feet, so to speak, and that brought us to Amherst, and it gave us a long, stable life. In terms of our home and our family life, certainly more stable relatively than I think we could have enjoyed in Puerto Rico, had we been able to stay. But when I went to law school, it was more about the fact that I went through a first marriage. I was pretty young when I got married the first time. I was 22. I was a political science and history major in college, and I figured I needed a way to support the family. And so when I entered law, it wasn't like my dream, or this was the thing I'd been building myself up to do. It was kind of a more practical decision, and while I was going through it, I didn't love it that much. I didn't enjoy law school. I didn't find it as intellectually challenging as I thought I might.
What? That's crazy.
And it's just because, I like theory, and in the way we teach law in America, there's very little theory. So you get into the technical, very boring aspects of law almost exclusively. And so that left me a little hungry. And that's what, I taught myself Greek during that time. That's how bored I was with my legal studies.
God, I wish.
I'll teach myself a language to deal with this. But and that's how I ended up at seminary, and that's what we met at Union.
That's right.
And then I did a doctorate, but then I went through some things in my life, and and so I didn't end up staying on that academic path. And eventually I found myself in journalism. And I loved it, but I couldn't find a way to make it work financially.
Yeah.
And one of the things I learned doing journalism, though, and I was doing politics journalism at this time, was that in society, the only persons who have real power without being elected officials, or maybe a police officer, like a law enforcement officer that, is authorized to do things most of us aren't authorized to do, are lawyers.
Right.
And it's not that a lawyer has their own power. What they're able to do is harness the power of the courts. But that really is a powerful thing, to be able to use the courts to make something happen. Like the courts have sheriff's deputies that go and enforce what they say, and the lawyer has that at their disposal. And even in public debates, when you're covering a legislative body, a doctor might go and they might give some public testimony, but it's not really listened to by anyone. The lawyers are the only ones whose words have any real weight there.
Yeah.
And at least for someone like me, if what you want to do is not just make a living, but feel like you're helping people, it pays all right, but it's not glamorous. It's the reality of law. Is to the extent there's money in it, it's really to make up for the stress and like the mental health costs of it. To be honest, it's like the work lawyers do has to be compensated at a certain rate, or people don't keep their sanity. They just don't. Like, it's just the reality.
Yeah.
The stakes are high. You've got like really important aspects of people's lives entirely in your hands. Sometimes there's hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars at stake.
Yeah. It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, and it takes you away from your family an awful lot. But if you want to help people and you're willing to take on some of that pressure and live with it, you're not going to enjoy it, because it's stress. It's not fun.
Sure.
But if you're willing to put up with it for the sake of helping others, it's a pathway unlike any other.
Sure.
I think it's just the reality.
Yeah.
As a journalist, I was part of breaking a big story in Baltimore, but I don't feel like that work ever made the sort of difference I can make just handling a simple case for a client. That's just the reality.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm glad you mentioned Union Theological Seminary. That's where I met R. And I always tell people, the Walter before Union and the Walter after is completely different. And as we were talking coming here, it's funny. I wanted to be an attorney. I thought it was the coolest thing. Like, I'm the smartest guy in the room, and I have a lot of power. Like I said, I think about Moses, the first attorney who, according to the Judeo-Christian teachings and scriptures, God gave Moses the laws, and he became the interpreter. And then from there comes the book of Judges, where they started to kind of bring judges to handle all these situations that are happening and continue to happen in humanity. I want to know from you, where does theology and the law intersect? Are they more parallel than intersectional, or are they just kind of like the DNA where they just zigzag?
I think it's more the latter. I think we tend to think of it today as sort of parallel. They're separate realms, and maybe there are points where they kind of come near each other or deal with similar issues. But I think if you look at, if you try to look up research on religion and law, what you tend to see come up is cases involving, say, separation of church and state.
Correct.
Or some religious institutions suing somebody, or maybe the question of tax exemption, or it's kind of like practical aspects, but it treats the question of religion as sort of settled as far as what it is, and the question is, how does that interact with this separate thing that is the law? But if we look at the history of law, and just the human history of law. You can't really separate law from theology.
Mm-hmm.
Law in human history descends from a notion of divine law. There's a notion that there are rules that govern human life, and we don't set them. And for most of antiquity, basic political theory said whatever divinity exists chooses our leaders. And their prescriptions, therefore, come from a divine source, even though it's mediated through this human person of, usually the king. But there's never been a time where what we understood as law wasn't understood to come from somewhere beyond us. And even when we talk about justice today, colloquially amongst ourselves, we'll notice that it's not really tied to something concrete. When we say something is unjust or unfair, we're not saying it deviates from a specific statute, or that it's not in line with this or that law, right? We mean something more sort of visceral. We feel like something is unjust or unright, but we're not tying it to a specific enactment that would make it so in human administration. And justice is a divinity, classically, right? It's a divinity worshipped in what today we call pagan religions that we descend from. But it is a divine notion, and when we seek justice, we're engaged in a theological activity, because we're not seeking just to see some specific letter of the law enforcement. Usually that's not what we mean when we talk about justice. What we talk about is something that I think is more overarching, right? And it clearly is a cry to the heavens. And so, I think that's one area in our context where that link between theology and law is still a little bit more clearly observed in the way that we speak about justice in a way that is technically disconnected from law as it is. Whereas if justice was strictly a legal concept, it would really just be a question of deviation from the letter. Right? That's all it would be. Justice is when we do what the law says. But that's not what most of us mean by justice. A lot of us think that there are laws that are unjust. And that's only possible if justice is something that exists outside of the law, beyond the law. And I think when you think about it in those terms, you realize just how theological it is. That's clearly the description of a God, something that lives beyond us, but that we must abide by its prescriptions, right? And so the reality is that law is very tied to theology. Even the legal foundations of the New World, what is referred to as the New World, were based on a theological understanding of the world. So the legal right of powers to come to the American continent and claim territory was premised on the fact that God created the world, and God established the church as God's representative on earth, and gave the church responsibility for the salvation of souls. And that responsibility gave the Pope authority to grant territories to Christian kings, who would then create avenues for the church to save souls. And so the legal authority, or the legal foundations of the country we live in, are based on a purely religious premise. The authority of the Pope to grant territory to Spain or Portugal is tied entirely to the fact that in that time, the powers that be were in agreement that God created the earth and established the church as his representative, and the Pope is the person of that representative. Absent that theological consensus, there is no legal basis for the European powers to claim territory in the New World. So theology is really wrapped up in our law and its history, even in its practical application, in ways we don't always appreciate.
As we came from court, and when you enter, there was the statue of Dr. Martin Luther King, right? A very well-known theologian and minister, right?
Yeah.
And it's like those two, they do dance with each other. When we think about divine law, and we think about the Code of Hammurabi, the influences that came from the cultic religions and things of that nature, and how all of that kind of set the tone for a lot of the things that we see here. Even theologically, as we say, God came to bring order from chaos.
Sure.
And order is synonymous to the law, right? Because if we have no law,
No,
there's
that's right.
chaos.
And I think even when you're in court, there's a liturgy. We don't think of it in those terms, right? But when you enter into the court, there's a clerk or an officer who announces what is the proceeding. You have to confess your name and say who you are. When the judge, who is the mediator of justice, enters the room, you stand up in the same way that when the priest enters the sanctuary, you stand up. And you don't sit down until they've assumed their position. There's a liturgy to the law. We don't think of it in those terms, but if you appreciate the history of where our procedures descend from, you realize, oh, I'm in church right now.
Yeah, it's a public confession.
It is a public confession.
And we were talking about...
And it's a public worship, right? When the judge comes in, they're wearing a vestment. It separates them from us, and they're mediating this power of justice that is beyond us, right? And you have to stand up because that is what you do in the presence of a divine power, right? And so you're forced into a sort of worshiping posture in the liturgy of the legal process. Like when you're expected to stand, you're expected to stand.
That's right.
And a judge can hold you in contempt and have you thrown in a cage by a
Facts.
person with a gun. If you don't feel like you have to respect the majesty of the courtroom. And so there's a lot about the law that we don't appreciate. It's very religious. And we're an animal that for a very long time has been a spiritual animal. And many of our practices descend from these sort of liturgical practices. A lot of what we do in a courtroom is essentially like a rite or a confession. Let's say these words in this order, and then something happens.
Right, and it's crazy. We were talking about the Salem witch.
Yeah.
Like those were trials that had religious connotations. If not the whole thing. The Inquisition with the first inquisitors. They were frowning people up in Europe because of
American law. Even in American slave law, it was generally illegal to make your slaves work on Sunday because Sunday was the Lord's Day. And so there were exceptions for certain classes of slaves, that you just needed to, I guess, operate the house or whatever. But even in a context where we didn't think of these persons as being endowed with all human rights, the Lord's Day was sacrosanct, and it was set apart even for this class of human beings that was obviously oppressed, right? And brutalized. And so, you really can't separate theology and law. Right? In our society, law, we think of it as secular, but it's really a theological undertaking.
Facts. And I want to kind of ease into this next topic that I think is so important, because I think it's a good mix or gumbo, if you will, of all the work that you have done. You wrote a book. You wrote a few, actually. I think this is two now, right? But I want to focus, and of course not including all the articles and stuff that you've written and commentaries, but this one really was like, I've been promoting this for you heavy, the crucifixion and resurrection of Freddie Gray. Wow. Like just the title alone. I know that a lot of your work with Stay Up News and the Afro, if I'm not mistaken, doing the independent journalism that you did, did a lot of ethnographic research and work, including even in law school too. You were out in these streets for real.
Yeah.
Talk to us about this book, like a summation, and you know, what are you hoping to the message to get out of this book? Because it's just so powerful.
I think, and I don't know that because I wrote this book before I entered the practice of law. You know, I had the degree.
Really? Right.
And I, had passed the bar some time ago, but I hadn't been practicing. And I think today I would have a better way to maybe articulate some of what I was trying to say in the book. But what I wanted to argue,
like a typical author, there's always stuff that you want to add. I should have done that. I think about that with my book all the time.
The next book, and I do hope to write a book about law and theology.
That would be.
And so this is my book on the way that our politics is today still really an extension of our theology. And we can go back to that notion of justice being a theological notion. And I think it's fair to say that Plato's Republic, sometimes I think Gilgamesh is the first work of political theory. But if we don't want to treat Gilgamesh, in terms of something that's a little bit more formally and intentional work on political theory, Plato's Republic is kind of where it starts for us in the West. And Plato makes an assertion in the Republic, which is that if you can structure the laws of a city after the laws of nature, after divine laws, then you will produce justice as the outcome. And it's the introduction of this idea of social justice into the Western imagination. And I think there's a strong argument that the church, the Christian church historically, is an experiment in this type of politics, a politics that seeks to see justice be the product of law and governance of a city. And you know that the Greek word for church is ecclesia, and that that is the same word that was used for the Athenian assembly of citizens.
Facts, that's right, yeah.
And so, we think of like the ecclesia as the church or the gathering, but really it's the called community of citizens. And so, what the church did was establish a polity whose goal was to see justice, divine law, enacted in the social realm. And we still see that today when churches oppose something like abortion, right? And the premise is that their commitments to divine notions that extend beyond, human experience requires that our laws reflect that justice.
Thanks. Yeah.
Right? And when Freddie Gray died in Baltimore, a material human being died. But the way the politics around that person's death played out became almost entirely about metaphysics. They became about race, and they became about history, and they became about justice, they became about oppression. And at the end of the day, none of the police officers were convicted in the death of Freddie Gray. Nothing really changed as a result in a place like Sandtown, Winchester. And the simple reality is Baltimore has struggled more every year since that year.
Yeah.
And that's going on 7 years now.
Wow.
And I just wanted to kind of ask or raise the issue in the book of the fact that a lot of times we want to make an eternal claim based on something that has happened in our immediate history. But sometimes the consequence of that is that we don't deal with the fact of what happened, and it becomes about something bigger like what is the right role of police in society. And that might be an important question, and maybe it implicates justice, maybe it doesn't, depending on how you want to think about that. But that's not really about whether this young person was unlawfully killed on this particular day. And I feel like the more the conversation around Freddie Gray's death became about the social issues, which are essentially the theological issues. Because most of what we say in our social justice discourses, whether we're explicitly Christian or not, are coming from that Judeo-Christian concern with the oppressed. The discourse of concern for the poor and the oppressed is an Old Testament discourse. It doesn't come from anywhere else.
That's right.
And so if you say you're into social justice but not Christianity, you're lying.
Right.
You're just lying. You might not be doing it intentionally. You might not know that this is where these ideas come from. But Christianity is a project in social justice. It's the idea that if society, the ecclesia, worships God in accordance with God's revelation, we will establish God's kingdom on earth, right? That's fundamentally a claim for social justice. And when we cry to the heavens and say some legal process that has played out, like the arrest of Freddie Gray, was unjust, what we're saying is our human laws don't sufficiently reflect divine truth. And they need to be brought in line so that justice can be produced in the city. We're arguing what Plato argued. And we might not be saying, no, but Plato said, and we might feel silly if somebody pointed out to us, aren't we just making Plato's argument in the Republic? But we are. And we're an animal that really subsists in a stream of traditions. We're born and we're given a language that today has existed for some time and is informed by a long history of thought, which is to say that we're given a lot of our ideas through our language. Right. And so we might think that we're referring to something that isn't necessarily theological, but if you're aware of the history of these ideas and you know where they come from, then you can't really separate them. And that so much of what we think today is a result of our religious traditions, whether we're specifically religious or not.
Given all that you said, if Freddie Gray was right here in front of you, what would you say to him?
I don't know. This probably welcome back maybe it's the first right? God damn. I don't know. Honestly, I think if he was here, I think the right questions would be, have you been able to go see your mother? How is she? How are your brothers? How, that sort of thing.
And you got to meet some
of his friends and and the people who knew him. I think fundamentally at the end of the day, if you have the time to concern yourself with an abstract notion like social justice, you need to appreciate the privilege you have. Most people have space to work and get home and spend some time with their family.
That's interesting. Someone checked me one time with that. He says it's a privilege to even think and have time that the world is messed up.
Right.
Because everybody
else is hustling. Right? Freddie Gray got caught up because he was known for having a hustle. And, when you come from that socioeconomic background, most of the jobs you have at your disposal, whether they're legal or illegal, require a lot of work. Life for a lot of people is bounded by whatever responsibility you have to make money and then whatever spare time you can spend with your loved ones. And it's not to say we shouldn't think about some of those bigger abstractions or that they don't matter. But we need to appreciate that sometimes we're just saying church words. And we're just saying church things. And that what the real question is, why didn't Freddie get to see his mother today? That's the question we should be concerned with. Not, did racism kill Freddie Gray, or, police brutality, or this and that, police-community relations. It is about that shit, but it's not. Fundamentally, the question is, why didn't Freddie get to see his mother today? And that is kind of what I was trying to communicate in the book, is that I think the politics around Freddie Gray made it harder to get a conviction. And
too much outside noise.
Yeah, and the reality is, if we're fair, that noise wasn't about Freddie Gray, right? Like, people were trying to fix racism or policing in the black community from like one instance in Baltimore that is really more complicated than just, police in a black neighborhood, right? Like, if you know that neighborhood, you also know that residents want police there because it's fucked up.
Yeah.
Like, kids get off the bus, and it's a public bus because there's no school buses. So they get off their transit bus where they're like commuting with adults who work in Baltimore, and they get to work on a bus. So you can guess how those adults feel on a daily basis. And those are like who the kids have to sit next to on the way to and from school.
Yeah. And
then they get off the school in Sandtown, off the bus, and they gotta walk a few blocks through like drug corners to get home, or to get to the library where they're gonna be till their parents pick them up, and their parents can't be around the neighborhood during the day because they have to go work, they have to get on a bus too and go to their job.
That's right.
And those persons would like their kids to get off the bus and be able to go home and not walk through an open air drug market. And those persons are also black. And some of those persons are homeowners, right? And so like they've invested, their wealth is tied up in this community.
Right.
And that needs to be protected too. We talk about intergenerational wealth. But the body in society that protects your wealth is the police, right? So if we're going to talk about policing in the black community, we also have to talk about how policing is a way of preserving wealth, right? It's not just, right? And in a sound town, it is over-policed, and there are people who have way too many interactions with police. But there are a lot of people who tell you, like, I don't have issues with the police because I'm not involved in this or that.
Yeah.
And so, if something like justice was going to come to that situation, it needed to be focused on the question of why a 25-year-old died in the back of a police van. Not, is policing corrupt in America? It may be, and it's not to say that's not an important conversation. It's just that you can't convict policing in America when you're hearing a case about Freddie Gray. The policing in America isn't on trial, and if that's what it becomes about, especially in a place like Baltimore where the people who end up on a jury have conflicted feelings, because they don't want oppressive policing, but they also don't want the rampant crime that exists in Baltimore, right? And the people who are on a jury are working civilians, right? And they're not fancy working civilians. Like, they're the ones who can't think of something to say to get out of jury duty, right? So they get stuck there listening to the whole trial for 6-7 days. And those persons aren't prepared to convict oppressive policing because they don't have a grad school student's experience of that. Right? It's not a theory in a classroom. It's not a study in a textbook. It's me trying to get from where I park my car to my front door. Right? And, I think sometimes we have to ask, why are we insisting on having the conversation on the basis of the terms that we're using? And that was kind of what I was trying to communicate in the book, that sometimes we think we're talking about a political issue, but we're really talking about a theological issue. And we need to do a better job of knowing when we're doing which and when one isn't that helpful.
So true.
Doing here good, yeah.
Or as we always do, the Know That Show podcast, we invite guests to share something that comes out of their show.
So I brought, the book is here.
Shout out.
I struggled a little bit with what to bring, and I gotta say, man, this is I've always loved this idea, the Know Thy Shelf. I thought it was so fresh, like the first time you explained it to me. But going through the exercise of like looking at your shelf and what am I gonna pick. You know, anyone who's watching it, I think it's worth going through the exercise. Even as just sometimes like, few of us are necessarily where we want to be or expected to be, you know, in our life, right?
Right. Yeah.
And going through your shelf, I think, helps remind you of, you know, remind you to be more appreciative of some of the things you have been able to do or experience.
Yeah.
Like maybe they weren't the things you planned out, but you kind of realize like, oh, like I've had some adventures and this has a significance from this and this has a significance from that. And it was an interesting exercise to go through. It was a little frustrating for me.
I can imagine.
Some of my stuff is still in boxes, and I know there's probably stuff packed away that would have been candidates for the show. So I went with something. This is technically on my coffee table. On display on my coffee table, not on the shelf. And this is technically on my wall, not on the shelf. But this is something I hang in my office. You know, when you go into a lawyer's office, you see the diplomas, you see the certificates from the highest court in the given jurisdiction that gives them the right to practice law in that jurisdiction. You know, and in some ways it's its own kind of little temple, right? The lawyer creates this sort of space, you know, with all these sort of essentially religious images, you know, decorated that the client's supposed to come in and be in awe of. And, you know, I have some of that on my wall too, of course, but this is my food stamps card. And this is how I was feeding myself when I was a journalist, because I just wasn't making any money doing that work. And for me, you know, it's a reminder, like, you know, not all your bets always pan out, but you can move beyond those challenges. But it's also important for me to display, because you know, I've got a law degree and I've got a PhD and I've passed a couple bar exams, and you know, but that's not to say it's always been easy or every decision I made was a good one. And you know, my clients are sometimes dealing with difficult situations. You know, if someone comes to me with an employment case and their job has been terminated, you know, they might have lost their home or, you know, gone through a lot of like difficult financial periods. Sometimes people are coming to me, they want to ask about a divorce and they feel ashamed that they're in this situation. You know, and it's important for them to hear from me, I've been divorced. You know, I get it. You don't have to justify it to me. And, you know, when someone feels like, you know, I used to, you know, when people feel like they've fallen into poverty, they feel like they've done something wrong. Like they failed more.
Ashamed, embarrassed.
And for me to be able to say, like, that's my food stamps card. So don't come in here thinking like you owe me an explanation or you need to feel ashamed about what you've experienced. And so I thought I would bring that today because I feel like that speaks to me, to something that, you know, we all need to hear from time to time. It's like, today I'm not on food stamps, thankfully. But you know, this helped me get to where I am today. That's just the reality. Like, the work I did in journalism never made me any money, but it built connections that eventually helped establish me as a lawyer.
Because as the saying goes, your net work is your net worth.
You know, and that's very true. And if I didn't have this food stamps card during that period, I wouldn't have been able to continue some of that work. You know, because this is how I could feed myself. And you know, my wife and I.
Shout out to Camille. Shout out to the baby Cora, Kid to the World. Oh man.
The benefit I had was just intended for one adult, but we stretched it every month to feed both of us. You know, and so, you know, and I know, and I've been in places where people feel, you know, that they're on food stamps and they'll say something about how they feel embarrassed about it. And I get that. You know, I remember pulling that fucking card out to pay for my groceries. It's the worst feeling, man.
Yeah.
And I was living in Baltimore, and I would go to like the Save-A-Lot, which is like one of these like discount chain type places. And everybody in that goddamn line had that card. And you know, part of it was like you felt better about it, right? Because like you're like, I'm not the only one. But you know, like we all had that same. You could tell anyone who has to pull out that card, like, takes like the same breath as they do it. You know what I mean? Like you're just like,
yeah.
You know, like it doesn't. But you know, it's important to know that even if that's a long-term thing, it's not what defines you. You know, and material success is so often an accident, right? Like. I can remember some stuff, so that lets me practice law, right? I can stuff information into my head. But there's plenty of times in history where that would have been a fucking useless skill, right? You know, like that's like, I couldn't have gained status that way, right? Depending on where I was born and when. I would have just needed different gifts, right? And I keep it on my wall so that folks don't feel like their challenges define them. You know, however long they last. And you know, I think that's, especially when you put it next to your diplomas and certificates, you know, it's a reminder that like there's ups and there's downs, you know. It's like Jay-Z says, I know this game's got valleys and peaks, expectation for dips. And that's life, you know. Even people that you think are like winning all the time are not. You know, like
there's always you know, it's interesting. I've come to the realization, you know, I got these degrees too and all this stuff, but the one thing that I've learned in this life, I know a lot, but I don't know shit.
Yeah.
I don't know a damn thing. And that's brought a lot of solace and humbleness into my life. And I've really been meditating and being real about that passage that says, you know, be quick to think and slow to speak. I've been speaking less, you know, only when spoken to.
Yeah.
You know, because I think I've said a lot, but I realize a few words are better than a lot. And I look at this card, and the word that pops out is independence. I don't know why, I just saw that card because the irony of it all, and not even the irony, right? Because it's like independence. This is what happened, because you utilize the system, not abuse it.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because, you know, to make, you know, the saying, you gotta fake it till you make it. I mean, in some ways, there's a lot of times, there's still things that I do that I share with you, I won't share here, that I do that's not related to my work, but I gotta make it happen because I got a family to feed, I got things to do, right? But ego can get in the way. What does ego stand for? Edging God out. And I think that I look at this, brother, and it's probably just as valuable as any other degree you've ever gotten in your life.
Yeah, this was an education. You know? And, it's funny, you know, when you have to use this card and it says independence, you know, you just feel like, you know, why are you patronizing this food stamps card? Like, you really got to do this right now. But, you know, it was essentially, for me, like the rich uncle I never had. Right? I didn't have family that could, like, pay my rent and buy my food. Turns out the government can buy your food. And at least during this period, I was trying to get my journalism project off the ground, but it essentially like subsidized my attempt to start my own business.
Yeah. Right?
And there's a lot of conversation in, you know, what we've referred to as communities of color about entrepreneurship.
That's right. Which we talk a lot about that here.
And about controlling your own destiny. So, like, look, if you qualify financially to have the government subsidize your attempt to start your own business, even if they patronize you with the word independence on the just apply.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you know, I know young men in Baltimore, and I'll, like, ask them, like, do you have health insurance? insurance. It's like, no. It's like, why? Like, you can get Medicaid for free, and it's good health insurance. Like, I get you might not want to apply and this and that, and I'll get it. Like, it's like, get the ego out, because that can... Health insurance a little less so when you're young, because you're not necessarily always utilizing it. But something like food stamps can, create the space you need to get to that next step. If you think about it like that.
Yeah, they cover the bare essentials so you can still do, you gotta, you can't think. I realize if I'm hungry, I can't think,
you can't. But you do, like, once you're there, I do think you have to, if you gotta have some sort of plan you're putting into.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Just the reality.
And this, I think, it leads to this final question I want to ask you. With all that, well, second to last, with all that you have under your belt and your experiences, my brother, just what's one piece of advice you would give to that young person who's following your path? Because there's a lot of journalist attorneys, a lot of minister attorneys, right? What's that advice you would give to that young person?
I think in life, you have to be willing to wrestle with God or the Spirit or the universe, however you understand that. But you also have to be prepared to surrender eventually. I think part of the reason that I struggled as long as I did is because I resisted becoming a lawyer, right? Like, I graduated from law school in 2007, and I passed the bar that summer, and I didn't practice law till 2019.
Wow.
Because I just, I wasn't into it. I maybe didn't also have the appropriate frame of reference in those earlier years in terms of like how I could really be effective. It felt like the only way I could be effective was to not make a good living. And in law, there's no way to deal with the stress of law and shitty pay. Like, it just doesn't work together. So something like journalism, maybe in my imagination made more sense, or even the academy. I was on that path for a while. But I think, and there were different moments in my life where the Spirit kind of warned me, like, I have plans for you in law. I expect you to do this. I was like, nah, make me. And it fucking did.
Just as
going through this experience, and you have to be willing to wrestle with the Spirit, because what it's telling you isn't always exactly clear. And that wrestling helps make it clear. What is it you're trying to get me to? But eventually you gotta admit you lost. Eventually you gotta admit, okay, it's not journalism, it's law. And it's not what I thought I wanted, but it's a purpose that I understand I need to be fulfilled.
And I really do believe that there's a power in that. Surrender and humility and letting go, man. Take a lot from our Islamic brothers and sisters that say, submit to God. That's what it means, just let it. And we all resisted. I was there too, man.
Yeah, I know.
I was there too. Our stories are so much alike, so many people, and I resisted, but somehow the Lord makes a path. But I also say, like I've said in the past, you gotta meet God mother effing halfway too.
Yeah,
you cannot just be on some let the Holy Spirit take it. Man, you gotta put in that work.
And that's where that wrestling, you have a responsibility to figure it out. Because it's most of us don't get a revelation like it's
or the privilege of just that moment. Other people are like, I got no time to think about what I want to dream about. I gotta feed these kids. I gotta go. Or if people want to find you, get your services, where can they get? Connect with you.
I have a couple of websites. One is in Spanish, susderechosciviles.com.
Your civil rights.
That's if I designed it for Spanish-speaking persons, the immigrant community, to have a place to go where they can find out about how civil rights law works in the United States and in the regions where I practice. The truth is, most persons who are like of immigrant backgrounds really aren't afforded enough protections oftentimes, and because of their status don't feel comfortable going into a court building, even as the plaintiff, and so we'll see what effect that has long term. But the other website for my law firm is alejandrolegal.com. And I still have the journalism project, stayup.news. I'm not super involved in it. I'm trying to get the news side of it up and running a little more. But if you're interested in sort of like arts and culture in the DMV area, Stay Up News is still somewhere you can go, both the YouTube channel and the website.
Yep, that's dope. That's amazing. And, R has certainly helped me. He's at your service. Please reach out to him. Before I wrap up with this quote, I love you, man.
I love you too.
I'm so proud of you.
Say, brother.
Yeah. All right.
Let me give you a few flowers, because I don't have a podcast to do it on, man. But I remember when you were doing 73, and I was staying with a mutual friend, Andrew, in Brooklyn.
Shout out to Andrew.
And you were off to some lounge or club to go film an interview, and you were.
I was out there, son. I was outside before outside. You heard?
And you were. 2, 3 in the morning, still working. And I remember, because we were gonna try to see each other, but you just got hung. And I remember, you sent me a text that was work first, and that has always stayed in my mind. And it's one of the things that helped me grind through this experience. Yeah. And your hustle with 73. What you did with your book and traveling the world with that has always been an inspiration to me. I'm just trying to live up to your example.
Oh, my brother, it's just I'm only here because God has mercy on me. As we always do, we end with a quote, and this one comes from the God, Fred Hampton. Shout out to all my Black Panthers, past, present, and future. And this quote reads as such: "You can jail a revolutionary, but you cannot jail a revolution." Peace, family.
Peace.
Couple fiends around the way that'll kick you for a head. And homie bought a Porsche, but his license ain't legit. Dog, I'm with the shits. Dog, go get the grips. Called my mama on the phone, told her where I stashed the bricks. Clappers in the Rover. Splash your fashion over. They know me like I'm Hova. Ain't no witnesses, Jehovah.